Hey guys, so we are going to start our last unit of the school year. Now that we finished the Civil War, we're going to start the Reconstruction unit. So we left off with the Civil War ending. The Union won, the South lost, even though some Southerners still think that the Civil War is going on today. But anyway, so we get to Ford's Theater. We had Lincoln showed up. The war had just ended 3 days earlier, and boom, he's killed. John Wilkes Booth by John Wilkes Booth. So now they had a plan somewhat for Reconstruction on what to do now that the war is over. We have slavery is abolished, and now the person who's going to lead them through it is dead, and we're left with this guy, Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson, he's a Democrat when Republicans are in charge. He was from Tennessee. He was the military governor during the Civil War. So he was a Unionist. So he did not secede from the Union. He didn't join the Confederates, but it's not like he was a great guy. So I'm going to take great pleasure in getting to rip him to shreds over this unit, because this is my favorite unit to cover, because we get to talk about how horrible of a person this guy was. So Andrew Johnson, he claims to be this great guy that was gonna, everybody thought that he was gonna lead the Union or lead the United States back together, build everybody back together, and start off this great new chapter in American society, because that's what could have happened. You know, this was a watershed moment in our country's history. We could have had tremendous change, and a lot of the issues that still plague us today could have been, solved. But I digress. So over this next unit, we're going to split it up into 3 different sections. We're going to learn about the failures of presidential Reconstruction, and then we're going to learn about radical Reconstruction with the radical Republicans, and then we're going to finish off with the ending of Reconstruction due to Klan violence and just the North giving up, essentially, on helping rebuild the South. So we're going to get going. And the first thing I want us to talk about is, what is freedom? So think about that. You know, you hear the word a lot, freedom, America, but we never really think about what exactly is freedom. So think about it from the different perspectives. To a former slave, freedom could be the ability to be mobile, to move, the ability to move where they want, to get an education, to vote, to own land. Those are the main things to a former slave, what freedom meant to them. Things that a lot of us today take for granted, but the ability to go wherever they want and not need those passes, the ability to have an education, the ability to vote, and the ability to own land, own property. But then to a white Southerner, they saw freedom as a privilege. White privilege. Anyway, so they saw it as a privilege and not something that's automatically given. So they thought that freedom should be something that you earn. And so, yeah, Reconstruction is just this period in U.S. history where these ideas competed against one another, and to see which one would gain supremacy. So which one, this freedom that everybody has the ability to own land, vote, get an education, and just be freedom of mobility, or this freedom that's a privilege that's acquired. So we're going to move into the similarities between Andrew Johnson and Abraham Lincoln. So the similarities between them. So at first, everybody believed that Andrew Johnson would be just like Lincoln because he was his vice president, but everybody believed that Andrew Johnson would end up carrying on the kind of the legacy and the policies that Lincoln first put forward, because both of them came from a poverty filled background. They both lacked a formal education, and they both were able to gain high political office. So Lincoln grew up poverty-stricken in Illinois. Andrew Johnson grew up poverty-stricken in Tennessee, and they both were able to achieve this high political office of president, even though neither of them had a formal education. But Johnson never actually accomplished anything as a politician, anything substantial. He never accomplished. He kind of just was right place, right time, and just victim, or he succeeded by circumstance, essentially. So we've got the similarities between them, but what are the qualities of Andrew Johnson? So he was stubborn. He refused to accept other views than his own, and essentially he was just a white supremacist. So he was not that great of a person, but yet he still managed to gain so much power and ability because of who he was. But anyway, so Johnson was supposed to bring this hope. He was supposed to bring this hope of continuing everything that Lincoln started, but yeah, no. So many believe that he would bring this Reconstruction policy of change. So people thought that he was going to radically change Southern society. He even was quoted as saying, "Treason must be unpleasant. Traitors must be punished severely." So treason must, so if you betray this country, if you are a traitor to this country, if you rebelled, your punishment should match that. It should be bad. You shouldn't just be able to get away with it. So it sounds good, but he didn't share the radical Republicans' views of using the government to give equality to free slaves. So yeah, while he said, slavery was bad, I guess, and we don't need that anymore, we need to punish those who are responsible, I don't think the federal government should do it. He believed that the states should have the ability to do it. But where does that get an issue? The states are the ones that seceded. So how are they going to punish themselves? But that just shows the contradictory views of him. But anyway, he didn't believe that slaves should be on the equal status as everybody else, even though they aren't slaves anymore. So Johnson, he starts to justify using his federal power. So how did he justify not using that federal government to make sure that former slaves were treated as equals? So he said he was a strong believer in states' rights. So he was a strong believer in states' rights. But states' rights was also the argument used to justify slavery to begin with. But anywho. So he said individuals should be punished, but since seceding was technically illegal, the state should be allowed to rejoin the Union. So he said, individuals should be punished. So the individual, like Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, they should be punished. He wanted the elites to be punished, Southern elites, those who pushed for war, to be punished. But he said, since secession, seceding from the Union was technically illegal, the states can't be punished. They should be able to rejoin the Union automatically. So it's very contradictory, but this was his justification for it. So it makes us wonder, why was he thinking that? He wants to get reelected. But anyway, I want us to, his true feelings start to show through about what he felt about African Americans. So like I mentioned in your directions, this whole Reconstruction unit comes from your short book that I gave to y'all before this quarantine, The Short History of Reconstruction. So while I'm not going to expect you to read every single chapter like we originally planned, since we're short on time. I'm giving you this lecture on it, but I want you to go through and you can use this as an extra resource to help you answer your notes. So his true feelings show through on page 84. So where I got this from: throughout his presidency, Johnson held the view that slaves had joined with their owners to oppress non-slaving white individuals. So he says, Johnson insisted that blacks possessed less capacity for government than any other race of people. Wherever they had been left to their own devices, they have shown a constant tendency to relapse into barbarism. So right there, he's saying this is why they don't deserve equal rights, because they're not worthy of it. That's what he believed. He believed that slaves weren't worthy of equal rights because he said anytime that they were left to their own devices or have any kind of independence, they just went back to barbarism, or just going back to, he saw them as like slave, or not slaves, but like you could say indigenous people. He saw them as barbarians, less than. So that's his justification, and it shows his true feelings of what he felt about black people. So he showed that he didn't believe that they were worthy of holding office or having equal rights. So he said they couldn't handle it, essentially. So this is one of my favorite parts. We get to Andrew Johnson's crazy slave conspiracy theories, not Trump's, even though, anyway, so Andrew Johnson had this crazy conspiracy theory. He said he was so against African Americans having any kind of rights, any kind of former slaves having any kind of rights, because he believed that during the Civil War, that the slaves worked with the Southern elites, and he believed that if they were given the right to vote, they would continue to work with the Southern elites to keep the poor white people oppressed. So let's just take a minute to think about this. So pretty much like I said in the picture, them their former whites will join the elites to restore slavery in the South. So he believed that slaves who had been enslaved in the United States for over 200 years at this point, who had been fighting to gain their freedom, to be viewed as human beings, would vote with the Southern elites who had enslaved them before to re-enslave themselves. That's just like saying that, disinfectant, if you inject it, it'll solve coronavirus. But what do I know? Anyway, I'm sorry, I keep getting mixed up for some reason. But anyway, so he believed that he was so against African Americans having equal rights that he believed that if they were given those rights, that the slaves would work with the Southern elite planters who had owned them previously. This is insane. But this is the thinking of the President of the United States. It's almost like history is repeating itself today, but I digress once again. So I want us to get to Johnson's Reconstruction Plan. Johnson's Reconstruction Plan. So I had to find this meme. Andrew Johnson issuing pardons to Confederate officials during Reconstruction. Everybody gets a pardon. Everybody gets forgiven. Everybody gets, get out of jail free card. So this was his Reconstruction Plan. So we remembered Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan. So Johnson's Reconstruction Plan, so his plan of how to rebuild the country, Reconstruction, he believed that full pardon and equal rights should go to the Southerners who pledged loyalty and supported emancipation. So he said, anybody in the South, whether you were a Confederate soldier, whether you were a general, whether you were just a common everyday person, if you pledged loyalty and support emancipation, you'll get a full pardon and you'll get your full rights back. It'll be like nothing ever happened. It'll be like hitting the reset button. And so he required, but those were the common people, and like not the generals, not the president like Jefferson Davis or any of the elites. Now the Southern elites, he required the Southern elites personally ask him for a pardon. So he believed that the Southern elites personally should ask him for a pardon. So please forgive me, sir. That's how petty he was. But he was so worried about punishing the Southern elites than helping former slaves. So he just showed that he was more worried about punishing those elites than he was about helping the former slaves gain their rights that they had been fighting for, that this whole war was about. That just showed how messed up he was. So let's talk about some of the issues that were with Johnson's Reconstruction Plan. So the main one that sticks out to me is his whole Reconstruction Plan did not mention anything about the whole point of Reconstruction was to bring former slaves into society, but yet this whole new plan kept them from gaining citizenship whatsoever, because in his mind, he said, oh, the Southern states, they will grant African Americans their freedom and their rights on their own. Each state will do it out of the kindness of their heart. These were the same states that had enslaved them and had seceded from the Union and fought a 4-year war with almost 1 million people dying, and now they're just going to miraculously give former slaves their rights. Yeah. Anyway, this is a president, right? Okay. Supposed to, completely alter the country for the better. So we get to this thing he came up with called the Ironclad Oath. It sounds great and wonderful. This Ironclad Oath. So it was an oath, right? Like I do solemnly swear, that Southerners would say that those who never took part in the rebellion, this was an oath that a Southerner who never took part in the rebellion could claim, and that these people who were loyalists throughout the Civil War, they were the ones who were put in charge of Southern governments after the war. So if they made this ironclad oath that they had never fought against the Union, then they had the ability to get put in charge of the Southern governments. So this guy could literally say, ooh, let's say me. I lived in the South during the Confederacy. I could say, I never fought in the Civil War. I never took arms against the North. I stayed loyal. Now, I own, 100 slaves and, didn't pay any taxes because I was an elite man. I still hate African Americans and wish they could go back to being enslaved. But I never fought against the Union, so you need to put me in charge of the state government. Okay, yeah. Literally, that is the Ironclad Oath. So all of these people were now being put in charge of the state governments that are supposed to be rewriting the state constitutions to give former slaves their rights. So, while they may have remained loyal to the Union, they had no desire to make Black people equal and give them equality. They had no desire to give them equal rights at all. But yet they were put in charge of government, state government in the South. So we move on to Johnson becoming the South's favorite president. So it's almost like, Oreos, Milk's favorite cookie. But anyway, so why was this was his first big failure. So our goal is to figure out what 3 big failures cause presidential Reconstruction to be a failure. So besides Andrew Johnson just being a crappy human all in all, why was his policies considered a failure? What was his first one? The first thing is his policies allowed the Southern leaders to appoint former Confederate officials to their old positions. So that's the first reason why it's a failure. So his policies allowed former Confederate generals, former Confederate politicians, Alexander Stephens, to be put back into their old positions. So he realized that he was giving the South the ability to define the rights or lack thereof for African Americans going forward. So the Southerners, at first they were like, crap, it's the end of the war, we lost, we're going to get punished. And then they're like, seeing Andrew Johnson putting them back in charge of their own state governments, and they're like, okay, this guy is either stupid or he's just wanting our support, but we're going to take advantage of it. So literally the Southerners realized he was giving them the ability to reshape their states how they wanted. And they liked it because they realized, hey, while we may not have slaves anymore, we can reshape our Constitution to where they're still going to be considered second-class citizens. That's exactly what they did. So they ended up letting former Confederates go free out of prison and be put back in charge where they just had left. So the example I keep mentioning is Alexander Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy. Before the Civil War, he was a congressman from Georgia. So he went to prison for about 6 months after the Civil War. But he claimed to not be originally for secession. He just said, I just went with Georgia because I'm loyal to my state. So he spent a few months in prison. Alexander Stephens pardoned him, and he became a governor of Georgia until he died. What punishment did he get for causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people? Nothing. Crazy. So the results, Johnson's very lenient policies were very lenient to begin with because he knew that he wanted the Southern elites as an ally. So he wanted the Southern elites to be an ally because he knew that they would help maintain white supremacy, because that was Johnson's biggest worry, was that African Americans would then be equal to him, God forbid. So he wanted to help maintain white supremacy all in the United States, and he wanted to get reelected. So his first big failure of presidential Reconstruction was the fact that he let former Confederates back into power. So, first failure. All right, we're moving on to black codes, the second failure of the presidential Reconstruction. So we're moving on to black codes. So you may have heard me mention this before, but after slavery ended, the Southern elites needed a new way to have a new source of labor to farm all of this new cotton that was starting to be sold again. And so they didn't have slaves. And so they said, oh, if African Americans have to be free now, we need to be able to control them, control the labor source. So they started out having these black codes, which is like a long list and series of laws that were driven to disproportionately affect African Americans. Almost like how our criminal justice system is set up today. Anyway. So the second failure of Reconstruction. So following slavery, like I mentioned, the elites needed a new source of labor, so they turned to the state governments for help. And the state governments responded by saying, all right, we're going to pass these things called black codes. And that tried to define how these former slaves could live their lives. So essentially, it was like creating a whole new form of slavery. So the main goal of the codes, they wanted to ensure that the black workforce, there was that black workforce for the elites. So the elites needed this labor source to help boost the Southern economy again and make them money. So their main goal was to ensure that there was a source of labor for the elites. So an example is that in Mississippi and South Carolina, shocker, South Carolina doing something backward, and Mississippi, these are the first states to pass these black codes. And they made each freedman, so a former slave, show proof of employment each year. At the beginning of each year, they had to have a proof of employment, and if they couldn't, then they would be arrested. So they had to show proof of employment, or else they would be they would be arrested. So, these mundane, asinine laws were passed, like, if an African American looked menacingly at a white woman, then he could be arrested. If someone was jaywalking, they could be arrested. And who do you think in the South they're going to enforce these laws against? Anywho, we move on to our third failure, education. So educational failure in the South. So these failures in the South, it showed just how far the white people were willing to go just to ensure that they didn't have to recognize former slaves. So they feared educating the black children. They feared educating the children that were African American, that were former slaves. Wonder why. And they'd see how contradictory everything that they taught was. Anyway, so they pushed to remove federal funding from state schools. That sound familiar? So they pushed to have certain schools that were predominantly African American or minority to have their funding removed, just so black children would not receive the same quality education as white children. So they were willing to destroy public education in the South just to make sure that they didn't have to have black children and white children on equal footing. That's how far they were willing to go. Okay, so we mentioned the three big failures, that being allowing the Confederates to take up positions in the government once again, the black codes that were allowed to be passed, and the educational failures. So how are people in the North going to respond? They see all this going on and it's like, wow, all of this is happening all over again. So at first, Northerners and Republicans were supportive of the president because they wanted to rebuild the Southern economy. The North has all the industry, the South has all the cotton. If they get the cotton started again, the North is going to make more money. So they were pushing to have the economy in the South jump started because the North thought that they would make more money as well. And so they claimed, though, that they just wanted to speed up the South being able to repay their war debts. But really, they knew that they were making more money. So anyway, now we get to the radical Republicans. So the Republicans with any common sense and decency. Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, these people. They were the only group to oppose the president because he lied about giving former slaves the right to vote. So when Johnson first took over as president after Lincoln was assassinated, he claimed, "Oh yeah, I'm going to keep all of all of Lincoln's policies. I'm going to make sure that black people eventually have the right to vote. I'm going to let the states pass it though, because the federal government doesn't have power to do that." But the radical Republicans saw that he was lying the entire time. And so the radical Republicans saw the black right to vote as the best way to reshape the South. So they saw that ensuring that former slaves had the right to vote, that's their best way to reshape the South, because the black vote was very powerful in the South if everybody was allowed to vote, because the African Americans outnumbered the white people in the South. Very powerful block of voting. Kind of like today. Anyway, so the radical Republicans faced opposition from both the Democrats and their own party in the Republican Party. So these radical Republicans were ostracized and faced opposition from not only the Democrats at the time, but the Republican Party at the time too. So they were a very small group of people. So they saw that unless the freedmen had the right to vote, then ending slavery was in vain. That whole war to end slavery was for nothing if African Americans weren't given the actual right to vote. Because what else was the war fought for? The war was fought to free the slaves and gain full citizenship. One perk of being a citizen is that you get to vote. So they led the charge to begin this new phase of Reconstruction, which we'll cover next, which is known as radical Reconstruction. So my main thing I wanted y'all to get to see is that at the very beginning, after Lincoln was assassinated, this period after the war was supposed to be this great and wonderful watershed moment of great change in our society. We could either go one way. We could go one of two ways. Forward with, bringing a more equitable society, or we could go back to the way that things were, just maybe change a little bit, but really keep those in power who were in power before would stay in power. And we were all the pieces were right there to help it happen, but yet we're going to see, because of people like Andrew Johnson, it became an overall colossal failure. So this is what we're going to finish our next two sections coming up, and hope you enjoy.